Hello, everyone. It's Charlene Lee, and I just realized my mic is on. Okay, there we go. Let's try that again. Hi, everyone. It's Charlene Lee, and I am broadcasting today from Boston, where I'm here for some company meetings to kick off the year. And I wanted to just kick off today by talking about why I'm talking about stakeholder capitalism. It's something I've been very interested in. And last week's live stream was around what is it? What's the definition of it? And today, I want to talk about what does it look like? What's the state of stakeholder capitalism? And I'll share some rankings from a great company, a nonprofit called Just Capital, and also some other research that's out there. And also just put a little bit editorial in here about how do you actually get started. I'll be having two more sessions this month about the metrics and also how to find those little grains and possibilities of success, how to actually go about doing that. So just what is the state of stakeholder capitalism? And to get this started today, I would love for you to share, if you can think of any, some companies that you think are doing a pretty decent job at trying to be stakeholder aware, to create more than just value for shareholders, but to also talk to and serve multiple stakeholders. And so just share where you're coming from today and also who you think is doing a good job. I'd love to see some examples of who you think is great. I want to say hi to Mohammed, who's coming in from Saudi Arabia, PC Sharma, Mr. Vone coming from Washington, D.C. So great to see you all. Please just keep chiming in on the comments and would love to hear from you. So first of all, where is stakeholder capitalism and where did it come from? It really evolved in the 1970s when Milton Friedman wrote a famous New York Times article that said the purpose of a corporation is to maximize shareholder value, to increase profits and therefore shareholder value. And this is a reaction to what was happening, which was a lot of what you would call stakeholder capitalism going on. And the problem with that is that companies were starting to lose sight of what was their true north. What was their purpose? And in particular, we're starting to dabble in things like community service, looking at politics. And frankly, the leaders were taking their eye off the ball of really running an effective, sustainable business. And so Milton Friedman goes, hey, you all, you got to focus on the one most important thing, which is maximizing shareholder value in the form of profits. And while this worked because people got very focused on maximizing that number, and the disadvantage is they focus on that number to the detriment of everything else. And this led to some really bad, unchecked behavior over the past 50 years. And what you could argue is that the rise of stakeholder capitalism was a real backlash to the rise of shareholder capitalism. And instead of saying that the only purpose of a corporation is to increase profits and therefore return value to shareholders, we also need to think about other stakeholders. And so one of the things that was essential was this this statement from the Business Roundtable back in 2019 in August. And I remember reading this in the pages of the Wall Street Journal, this full page ad. And it basically said this, that the purpose of a corporation is to maximize value across multiple stakeholders. And they name 5 to be in particular, in addition to shareholders, there was also customers, employees, suppliers and partners, and then community and society. So I want to take a look today at what's happened since then. This was a big and bold statement on the part of the Business Roundtable. And the World Economic Forum, United Nations, many other organizations since then have also come out to say we got to do more than just be really supporting shareholders. And I think today, what you would actually find is that in reality, there are very, very few CEOs, very few boards of directors who would say in a naked way, the whole purpose of our organization is just to return value to our shareholders. Forget everyone else, forget about our customers, forget about employees, forget about society and the environment, forget about our supply chain. It's just about profits to our shareholders. Very, very few CEOs would actually publicly say that. And so to that extent, I think the fact that stakeholders and this whole idea that it's got to be more than just profits has really made a huge impact. The disadvantage, or the reality, is also that signing a statement like the purpose of a corporation that the Business Roundtable put out. 181 CEOs in the United States signed that statement. And that's all it is. It's just a statement that says we will try our hardest to serve all stakeholders, but there's no teeth in that agreement. The reality is there's a big difference between saying you support something in theory as a principle and then actually doing it. And this is the biggest problem. It doesn't commit any company to make any sort of meaningful change. And you've seen that. Since then, some companies have done some really bad things. Wells Fargo was found out to have been interviewing people without any desire to actually hire them, women and minorities in particular, just to meet diversity numbers. They were charging people extraordinary amounts, fabricating accounts for them. And so they were one of the signers of that document. And so they were fined significantly, many things going on with them. So you could say not good behavior on the part of Wells Fargo, even though they had signed this agreement. Other companies like Uber, PG&E, Boeing, Meta have had some significant setbacks in the things that they did, engage in very bad behavior. They didn't actually sign this agreement, so maybe you can't hold it against them that they said they would and then they didn't. But the reality is, again, who are they truly serving, and why do we continue to see these bad behaviors? I think the fact that we are actually calling them out now, these bad behaviors, and also highlighting good behaviors is a really good step in that right direction. And one organization in particular who I think have done a really good job is Just Capital. And I shared last time some of the research they did. This was, again, a survey of the issues that they surveyed Americans. What are the most important topics for them? And by far, it was paying a living wage. And they use that data to then create something called the Just Capital ratings. And they just released it on January 10th of this year's ratings. And they take a look at the Russell 1000 companies, so largest 1,000 companies that are publicly traded in the United States. And they looked at all these different metrics around workers, around customers, communities, the environment, and gave them all scores and then rated them. And at the very top was Bank of America. And I'll put a link to the rankings into the chat here. Just give me a second so you can go and take a look at it yourself. And I'll switch over to a different screen in just a second. But what I really like about these rankings, is that they call out the top 100 companies and also highlight the ones who are doing really well in their industries and across different sectors. So let me just show you what that looks like, because I think it's fascinating to see what it is. I'm just going to maximize the screen here for a second, and we can play with this a little bit. Hopefully, fingers crossed, this works. So you can see here that one of the things you can see is that this was a ranking. Let me just show you all the rankings. So these are all the rankings across all the different companies. And you can also view it by who ranked the best in terms of workers. Bank of America, because that's ranked the highest. And also it accounts for 44% of the score, how well they do with workers. But you can also see who did the best when it came to customers. AES, which is an energy utilities company. You can see who did the best in terms of environment, Workday, but you can also see here Procter & Gamble didn't do well overall, but did really well in terms of the environment because of their focus on recyclable and compostable packaging. And then you can also look into all the different areas. So, for example, minimizes air pollution and focusing on scope 3 emissions, for example, in their work. So there's lots of different ways that you can be looking at all of these rankings. So really take your time and look at those rankings. I think Just Capital does an amazing job. Having gone through the methodology process and talked to Martin Whitaker, their CEO, about the work that they do, is just fantastic if you want to understand, again, from a very specific perspective, what does a just company look like? And then also, it's, again, very focused on the US only. So one of the things I think is especially interesting about all of this is that when you look at these rankings, in particular, looking at the specific stakeholders that really matter, I want to go through just three of them: the customers, the employees, and then also society. There's some really good resources out there thinking about each of these areas, and I want to highlight a few of them. So just thinking about customers as a stakeholder, in some ways, this seems obvious that we should be serving customers better. But the reality is, most companies are not customer focused, or even more specifically, customer centric. And it's interesting, if you go back to one of the best and greatest, I think, business leaders and thinkers and authors, Peter Drucker, he wrote in one of his books, there is only one valid purpose of a corporation, and that is to create a customer. And the idea is that if you're going to make money, the way you make money is to deliver value to customers. The goal isn't to increase your profits and return money to shareholders. The goal is to serve your customers, which in turn, if you do that well, will increase the value of the company and return value to shareholders. So the ultimate goal will be to serve your stakeholders that way, your shareholders that way, but it's also very important to focus on your customers. And it feels in some ways that this idea of customer, some people have called it customer capitalism. And in particular, people like Roger Martin, who was a former dean of the Rotman School of Business at the University of Toronto, and somebody who's been a mentor to me over the years. Roger talked about customer capitalism and the importance of designing your entire organization around the customer. And yet most companies don't do this very well because we're organized around products, around services. And so we don't focus on the customer needs and work backwards from that. Instead of putting the company at the center, and customers are just one of the things you do, customer-centric organizations put customers at the center and then evolve everything around those customers. And it's really, really hard because customers will almost always move faster than you will. So you're always trying to catch up. It's one of the big tenets behind the work that I do. It was the core focus of my latest book, The Disruption Mindset, where the best organizations able to weather the storms and disruptions and anticipate where the world is going are the ones that are focused on their future customers, not even the customers of today. So I'm a big believer in understanding and serving these customer stakeholders. It has been the bedrock of so much of the work that I do. And yet, when you think about how well organizations serve customers, frankly, just even listening to customers and taking them seriously, not many do. So this is a huge shift. And and in the next couple of weeks, I'll be talking about some of the metrics around how to measure customer centricity. So we'll talk about that next week. The second stakeholder I want to talk about the state of this is serving employees. And this is something that Just Capital, again, does a very good job. And they've done a bit of a deep dive into the number one company, which is a bit of a surprise, was Bank of America, number one in the rankings of a Just company for 2013. And it's surprising because I've been following Bank of America for the past decade or so, especially since Brian Moynihan took over in about 2010. He inherited a huge mess because of the financial crisis. They had bought Merrill Lynch and all of the defaulted loans and mortgages that they had from Countrywide too as well. Let me just read out some of the stats. They got a $45 billion bailout from the government for Merrill Lynch. They had to pay $76 billion in fines over the past decade, more than any other bank. And they just made some really not very smart moves. For example, they were charging back in 2011 customers a $5 ATM fee, which they reversed very quickly because of the uproar. And since then, they've done a lot of things. And especially over the past 2 years, Brian Moynihan has really doubled down, especially on employees. One of the commitments they made 2 years ago was to increase the minimum wage that paid in the company to $25 an hour by 2025. And they just increased it to $22 an hour. So they're on track to increase it $1 every year to, again, address the number one issue for Americans in that poll that Just Capital did, which is to pay a living wage. They have 16 weeks of paid paternal leave, which is incredible, much more than most companies. They have flexible scheduling. And then across their environmental aspects, they've also committed to being net zero by 2050, getting very far away. But they're doing it at a scope 3 level, which is, again, very unusual. Most companies are committing to scope 1 and 2, which are your own emissions directly from your products and services, and the ancillary emissions that come from, for example, people driving to work, other people, again, related that your company actually generates, but isn't in the direct delivery of your products and services. They committed to scope 3, which means everything else in the supply chain. Again, from their suppliers and the emissions they have, all the way down to the emissions of their customers. To just give you an idea where that is, only 19% of banks had committed to that level, and 32% of the Russell 1000. So while there's still some momentum around this, it's still not the norm for companies to be doing this. So again, I think there's ways to be thinking about how to serve employees, and Bank of America has really done a good job across multiple dimensions of serving employees and also society to make that happen. And so the last area I want to focus on is thinking about the serving society. I'm going to skip supply chain for now, but just going to society, which is our communities, inequity in our society, and then also the environment. And I really like what Victor Cho has been writing. He reached out to me after last week's session. Again, I encourage you all to reach out to me if you have questions or thoughts. And he shared with me some great research that he's been putting together. I'll put it into the comments here. You can read about it at victorcho.com, fourth stakeholder. And it's in the comments, so you'll be able to see it there. And one of the things, let me just show it here too as well. So there you go. He writes about this fourth stakeholder, which is society, and why it's so difficult. And one of the things he writes about is that we have this issue of the tragedy of commons, and in particular that the purpose of a business oftentimes is to pursue that profit and health, to pursue its own profit and health at the expense of society. So it's consuming things. And this is not a new idea. It was developed in the 1850s from an observation by an economist looking at sheep grazing. And so if everybody in town, all the farmers, put their sheep in the commons at the center of the town and just let them eat as much as they want, and then the commons would be destroyed. Whereas everybody takes turns, they go out into the pastures, go further out and share that resource, it's actually spared and kept going on a sustainable level. And so the problem here is that if no one farmer, no one company is necessarily at fault for causing all these problems in our society, inequity in income, for example, lack of access to education, clean water, enough food and housing, but also the environment. No one company is responsible, but no one company can also solve the problem. So this is a tragedy of the commons, and the way to overcome that is to either have top-down regulations. The town puts in an ordinance that says you can only graze your sheep for 2 hours at a time or something, or people gather together and cooperate and come to an agreement to say, we'll agree not to graze our sheep more than 2 hours at a time, and we'll keep each other accountable for this. So this is the problem right now. And this is the state and why it is so difficult to get agreement. And we can see from the various environment conferences that have happened in COP26, COP27, and the biggest difference between these two conferences happened a year apart, November of 2021 and 2022, is that over the past year, companies have gotten together and said, we need to get together and figure this out, because we can see on the horizon that regulators are going to come after us and regulate this, or we can take our own actions and stay ahead of that game, and really figure out how we can benefit from the business of being green and also do well by our societies too. So it's interesting. Again, there's a whole series of articles, really easy to read from Victor. And Victor is the CEO of Evite. So he's speaking from a place of his own experience in doing this. In terms of, for example, when people schedule events, Evite will also go out and encourage people to donate to a nonprofit of their choice and make it super easy to make that happen. So it's not something that's built into the business, but he's found a way to scale the impact on society while also scaling his business. So there are great examples out there, and I'll spend the next 2 times going into those in more detail. But I want to give you, as a parting thought for today, just a couple thoughts on what you can do to get started on this. There are multiple stakeholders out there. Again, you've got your shareholders, of course. You have your customers, your employees, supply chain, and then you have, of course, the society, communities, environment. And determine, first of all, which are the most important stakeholders to you. And at a minimum, it's so easy to start with customers. Make sure that you're starting to spin your company, pivot your company around your customers, and in particular, being much more focused on them and investing in them, investing in that relationship, becoming much more customer centric, which means you'll have to be able to be much more agile, have different ways of working, become less hierarchical, faster moving, more disruptive in the way you run your business. The second thing is then think about what the role is of your employees. We're doing some active research right now at PA Consulting around employees and how they are being engaged or not engaged, which are the most important ones to focus on. So think about, who are your employees? How are they adding value to your customers in particular? And also, how are they helping you achieve all the other things that are on your agenda? Instead of thinking about them as just a cog in the wheel of the machine, what are the things that they are needing? How are the ways that you are treating them better so that they can do a better job too? And then the third thing is to start thinking about how you're going to measure all of this. And that's what I'll be talking about next week. But I would encourage you to think about, how would you measure the fact that you're becoming more customer focused, that you're serving their needs? How would you understand the needs and the wants and the desires of your employees? And how would you know that you're actually doing a better job of that? I think some of the metrics that are available in Just Capital's ratings, again, I'll put those up too as well. Again, you can find those Just Capital ratings at justcapital.com/rankings. And they have, again, just a tremendous amount of research there around the metrics they use, especially to measure employee well-being and employee benefits. So you can take a look at those. So take a look and really measure what matters. In the end, you can only measure and track so many things on your personal dashboard. What's most important to you? And my hope is that you'll start putting some of these stakeholder capitalism, stakeholder value metrics deeply into your dashboard, so you can see what your day-to-day impact is going to have on the long-term impact against these stakeholders. And to close out, I just want to share just next week what I'm going to be talking about, which is metrics around ESG, environmental, social, and governance goals, around environment, around customers. All of these metrics, they're a mess. Honestly, there are so many. And my biggest beef with them is that, do they actually measure value? So next time we'll be talking about that. I just want to see if we have any questions or comments. I don't have any comments here today right now, but just also want to say hi to Rostam from Tunisia, Venus coming from Iran. And just again, thank you so much for joining for today. Again, I'm very passionate about this whole idea of stakeholder capitalism. And the idea, it's a very unfortunate name in some ways, but if you look at the state of it is, we still have a long way to go, but I'm very, very encouraged by what we're seeing today, that there is a movement afoot, that we are possibly participating in a sea change of how we set up and run our businesses. And at the center of that is going to be you as a leader, you thinking about, what kind of difference can I make? And again, you don't have to be in a leadership position to be a leader. A leader creates change when they see that change is needed. And so I encourage you to think about stakeholder capitalism at the most micro level, which is, how are you going to change the way you think about your work, how you deliver the work, the impact it has, and to start thinking about all the different stakeholders that you and your organization impact, and to start advocating for a change in the mindset of our leaders and our organizations to say, it's one thing to talk about it, it's another thing to actually do it. So next week, we'll talk about metrics, and then we'll also be talking about the week after, how do you actually find that needle in the haystack, those tiny little wins that then will escalate and snowball into bigger and bigger wins. So until then, next week, take care. Think about which are your most important stakeholders and what metrics actually matter, because I would love for you to share those next week. Until then, take care, and I'll talk to you all soon. Thanks.